Ladies and gentlemen, students, scholars, teachers, trainers, professors, professionals, officers, official listener learners, I welcome all respected officials and directors. I welcome all honorable ministers, managers. I welcome all adorable advocates, elders, and institute advisors. I welcome the most honorable President Mr. Modi ji. Very nice time, nice place, nice section that we are describing, explaining, expressing our holy Indian spiritual, cultural, social identities in the form of unity and diversity. The Puritan is our today's topic. The Puritan is it starts from 1620. It ends with 1660. The Puritan movement in its broadest sense, the Puritan movement may be regarded as a second and greater renaissance, a rebirth of the moral nature of man following the intellectual awakening of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. In Italy, whose influence had been uppermost in Elizabethan literature, the Renaissance had been essentially pagan and sensuous. It had hardly touched the moral nature of man, and it brought little relief from the despotism of rulers. One can hardly read the horrible records of the Medici or the Borgias or the political observations of Machiavelli without marveling at the moral and political degradation of a cultured nation. In the North, especially among the German and English peoples, the Renaissance was accompanied by a moral awakening, and it is precisely that awakening in England that witnessed moral and political reform, which have swept over a nation in the short space of half a century, which is meant by the Puritan movement. We shall understand it better if we remember that it had two chief objects. The first was personal righteousness, the second was civil and religious liberty. In other words, it aimed to make men honest and to make them free. Such a movement should be cleared of all the misconceptions which have clung to it since the Restoration, when the very name of Newton was made ridiculous by the jeers of the gay courtiers of Charles II. Though the spirit of the movement was profoundly religious, the Puritans were not a religious sect. Neither was the Puritan a narrow-minded and gloomy dogmatist, as he is still pictured even in the histories. Pyme and Hampden and Eliot Milton were Puritans, and in the long struggle for human liberty, there are few names more honored by free men everywhere. Cromwell and Thomas Booker were Puritans, yet Cromwell stood like a rock for religious tolerance, and Thomas Booker in Connecticut gave to the world the first written constitution in which free men, before electing their officers, laid down the strict limits of the offices to which they were elected. That is a written document, and it marks one of the greatest achievements in the history of government. From a religious viewpoint, Puritanism included all shades of belief. The name was first given to those who advocated certain changes in the form of worship of the Reformed English Church under Elizabeth, but as the ideal of liberty rose in men's minds and opposed to it were the king and his evil counselors and the band of intolerant churchmen of whom Lord is a great example. Then Puritanism became a great national movement. It included English churchmen as well as extreme separatists, Calvinists, Covenanters, Catholic noblemen, all bound together in resistance to despotisms in church and state, and with a passion for liberty and righteousness such as the world has never since seen. Naturally, such a movement had its extremes and excesses, and it is from a few zealots and fanatics that most of our misconceptions about the Puritans arise. Life was stern in those days, too stern perhaps, and the intensity of the struggle against despotism made them narrow and hard. In the time of Puritanism under Cromwell, severe laws were passed. Many simple pleasures were forbidden, and an austere standard of living was forced upon an unwilling people. So the criticism is made that the wild outbreak of immorality which followed the restoration of Charles was partly due to the natural restrictions of the Puritan era. The criticism is just, but we must not forget the whole spirit of the movement. That the Britain prohibited maypole dancing and horse racing is of small consequence beside the fact that he fought for liberty and justice, that he overthrew despotism and made a man's life and property safe from the tyranny of rulers. A great river is not judged by the form on its surface, and certain austere laws and doctrines which we have ridiculed are but froth on the surface of the mighty Tibetan current that has flowed steadily like a river of life through English and American history since the age of Elizabeth. Changing ideals. The political upheaval of the period is summed up in the terrible struggle between the king and the parliament, which resulted in the death of Charles at the blow and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Cromwell. For centuries, the English people had been wonderfully loyal to their sovereigns. But deeper than loyalty to kings was the old Saxon love for personal liberty. At times, as in the days of Alfred and Elizabeth, the two ideals went hand in hand, but more often they were in open strife, and a final struggle for supremacy was inevitable. The crisis came when James I, who had received the right of royalty from an act of parliament, began, by the assumption of divine right, to ignore the parliament which had created him, of the civil war which followed in the region of Charles I, and of the triumph of English freedom. It is unnecessary to write here the blasphemy of a man's divine right to rule his fellow men was ended. Modern England began with the charge of Cromwell's brigade of Britons at Naseby. Religiously, the age was one of even greater ferment than that which marked the beginning of the Reformation. A great ideal, the ideal of the national church was bounding to pieces like a ship in the breakers, and in the confusion of such an hour, the action of the various sects was like that of frantic passengers, each striving to save his possessions from the wreck. The Catholic Church, as its name implies, has always held true to the ideal of a united church, a church which, like the great Roman government of the early centuries, can bring the splendor and authority of Rome to bear upon the humblest village church to the farthest ends of the earth. For a time, that mighty ideal dazzled the German and English informers. But the possibility of a united Protestant church perished with Elizabeth. Then, instead of the worldwide church, which was the ideal of the Catholicism, came the ideal of a purely national Protestantism. This was the ideal of loud and the reactionary bishops, no less than of the scholarly Richard Hooker, of the rugged Scotch Covenanters, and of the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. It is intentionally interesting to note that Charles called Irish rebels and Scotch Highlanders to his aid by promising to restore their national religions, and that the English Puritans, turning to Scotland for help, entered into the solemn covenant of 1643, establishing a national Presby- Presbyterianism whose object was to bring the churches of God in the three kingdoms to uniformity in religion and government, to to preserve the rights of Parliament and the liberties of the kingdom, that we and our posterity may, as brethren, live in faith and love, and the Lord may delight to live in the midst of us. In this famous covenant, we see the national, the ecclesiastical, and the personal dream of Lutheranism side by side in all their grandeur and simplicity. Years passed, years of bitter struggle and heartache before the impossibility of uniting the various Protestant sects was generally recognized. The ideal of a national church died hard, and to its death is due all the religious unrest of the period. Only as we remember the national ideal and the struggle which it caused can we understand the amazing life and work of Bunyan or appreciate the heroic spirit of the American colonists who left home for a wilderness in order to give the new ideal of a free church in a free state its practical demonstration. What are the literary characteristics? In literature also the Plotinus was one of in literature also the Plotinus was one of confusion due to the breaking up of old ideals, medieval standards of chivalry, impossible laws and romances of which Spencer furnished the types, perished no less surely than the ideal of the national church, and in the absence of any fixed standard of literary criticism, there was nothing to prevent the exaggeration of the metaphysical poets, who are the literary parallels to religious sects like the Anabaptist poetry took new and startling form in Donne and Hubbard, and prose became as somber as Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. The spiritual gloom which sooner or later fastened upon all the writers of this age, and which is unjustly attributed to Puritan influence, is due to the breaking up of accepted standards in government and religion. No people from the Greeks to those of our own period have suffered the loss of old ideals without causing its writers to cry, Ishabod, Ichabod. The glory has departed. That is the unconscious tendency of literary men in all times, who look backward for their golden age, and it need not concern the student of literature, who even in the breakup of cherished institutions look for some gleams of a better light which is to break upon the world. This so-called gloomy age produced some minor poems of exquisite workmanship and one great master of was whose work to glorify any age or people. John Milton, in whom the indomitable Puritan spirit finds its noblest expression. There are three main characteristics in which Puritan literature differs from that of the preceding age. One is the Elizabethan literature, with all its diversity, had a marked unity in spirit, resulting from the patriotism of all classes and their devotion to a queen who, with all her faults, sought first the nation's welfare. Under the Stuarts, all this was changed. The kings were the open enemies of the people. The country was divided by the struggle for political and religious liberty, and the literature was as divided in spirit as were the struggling parties. Louis Elizabethan literature is generally inspiring. It throbs with youth and hope and vitality. That which follows speaks of age and sadness. Even its brightest hours are followed by gloom and by the pessimism inseparable from the passing of old standards. Pre-Elizabethan literature is intentionally romantic. The romance springs from the heart of youth and believes all things, even the impossible. The great schoolman's credo, I believe, because it is impossible, is a better expression of Elizabethan literature than of medieval theology. In the literature of the Puritan period, one looks in vain for romantic ardor. Even in the lyrics and love poems, a critical, intellectual spirit takes its place, and whatever romance asserts itself is in form rather than in feeling, a fantastic and artificial adornment of speech rather than the natural utterance of a heart in which sentiment is so strong and true that property is its only expression. Literature of the Puritan period. The transition points when one attempts to classify the literature of the first half of the 17th century from the death of Elizabeth 1603 to the Restoration 1616. He realizes the impossibility of grouping poets by any accurate standard. The classification attempted here have small dependence upon dates or sovereigns and are suggestive rather than accurate. Thus Shakespeare and Bacon wrote largely in the region of James I, but their work in Elizabethan in spirit and Bunyan is no less important because he happened to write after the Restoration. The name of metaphysical poets given by Dr. Johnson is somewhat suggestive but not descriptive of the followers of Donne. The name Caroline or Cavalier poets brings to mind the careless temper of the royalists who followed King Charles with a devotion of which he was unworthy, and the name Spenserian poets recalls the little band of dreamers who clung to Spenser's ideal, even while his romantic medieval castle was battered down by science at one gate and Platonism at the other. At the beginning of this bewildering confusion of ideal expressed in literature, we note a few writers who are generally known as Jacobean poets, but whom we have called the transition poets because with the later dramatists they show clearly the changing standards of the age. Samuel Denial 1562 to 1619. Samuel Denial, who born in 1562 and died in 1619. Denial, Daniel, who is often classed with the first metaphysical poets, is interesting to us for two reasons. For his use of the artificial sonnet and for his literary discussion of Spenser as a model for poets, his Delia, a cycle of sonnets modern, perhaps after Sidney, Astrophel and Stella, helped to fix the custom of celebrating love or friendship by a series of sonnets, to which some pseudonym was affixed. In his sonnets, many of which rank with Shakespeare, and in his later poetry, especially the beautiful Complaint of Rosamond and its civil wars, he aimed solely at grace of expression and became influential in giving to English poetry a greater individuality and independence than it had ever known. In matter, he set himself squarely against the medieval tendency. Let others sing of kings and paladins. In his accents and untimely words, paint shadows in imaginary lines. This fling at Spencer and his followers marks the beginning of the modern and realistic school, which sees in life as it is enough poetic material without the invention of allegories and impossible heroines. Daniel's poetry, which was forgotten soon after his death, had received probably more homage than it deserves in the praises of Wordsworth, Southey, Lamb, and Coleridge. The later says, read Daniel, the admirable Daniel. The style and language are just such as any pure and manly writer of the present day would use. It seems quite modern in comparison with the style of Shakespeare. The songwriters, in strong contrast with the above, are two distinct groups, the songwriters and the Spenserian poets. The close of the reign of Elizabeth was marked by an outburst of English songs, as remarkable in its sudden development as the rise of the drama. Two causes contributed to this result: the increasing influence of French instead of Italian verse and the rapid development of music as an art at the close of the 16th century. The two songwriters best worth studying are Thomas Campion (1567 to 1619) and Nicholas Bracken (1545 to 1626). Like all the lyric poets of the age, they are a curious mixture of the Elizabethan and the Puritan standards. They sing of sacred and profane love with the same jest, and a careless love song is often found on the same page with a plea for divine grace. The Spenserian poets of the Spenserian poets, Giles Fletcher and Wither, are best worth studying. Giles Fletcher, born in 1588 and died in 1623, had at times a strong suggestion of Milton, who was also a follower of Spenser in his early years. In the noble simplicity and majesty of his lines, his best known work, Christ's Victory and Triumph, 1610, was the greatest religious poem that had appeared in England since Pius Plowman, and is not an unworthy producer of Paradise Lost. The life of George Wither, 1588 to 1667, covers the whole period of English history from Elizabeth to the Restoration, and the enormous volume of his work covers every phase of the literature of two great ages. His life was a varied one, now as a royalist leader against the Covenanters, and again announcing his Puritan conviction and suffering in prison for his faith. At his best, Wheeler is a lyric poet of great originality, rising at times to positive genius, but the bulk of his poetry is intolerably dull. Students of this period find him interesting as an epitome of the whole age in which he lived. But the average reader is more inclined to nod with interest that he published in 1623 Hymns and Songs of the Church, the first hymn book that ever appeared in the English language, the Metaphysical Points. This name, which was given by Dr. Johnson in Garrison because of the fantastic form of Donne's poetry, is often applied to all minor poets of the Puritan age. We use the term here in a narrow sense, including the followers of Daniel and that later known as the Cavalier poets. It includes Donne, Hubbard, Waller, Denham, Cowley, Wagon, Damden, Marble, and Prussia. The advanced student finds them all worthy of study. not only for their occasional excellent poetry, but because of their influence on later literature. Thus, Richard Prasha, 1613 to 1649, the Catholic mystic, is interesting because his troubled life is singularly like Donne's, and his poetry is at times like Herbert's set on fire. Abraham Cowley, 1618 to 1667, who blossomed young and who, at 25, was proclaimed the greatest poet in England, is now scarcely known even by name, but his literary work set an example which influenced English poetry throughout the 18th century. Henry Wagan, 1622 to 1695, is worthy of study because he is in some respects the forerunner of Wordsworth and Andrew Marvell, 1621 to 1678, because of his loyal friendship with Milton and because his poetry shows the conflict between the two schools of Spenser and Donne. Edmund Weller, 1606 to 1687, stands between the Puritans and the Restoration. He was the first to use consistently the claused couplet which dominated our poetry for the next century. By this, and especially by his influence over Dryden, the greatest figure of the Restoration, he occupies a large place in our literature than a reading of his rather tiresome poetry would seem to warrant. Of all these poets, each of whom has his special claim, we can consider here only Donne and Hubbard, who in different ways are the types of revolt against earlier forms and standards of poetry. In feeling and imagery, both are poets of a high order, but in style and expression, they are the leaders of the fantastic school whose influence largely dominated poetry during the half century of the Puritan period. Now, John Donne, who born in 1573 and died in 1631. The briefest outline of Donne's life shows its intense human interest. He was born in London, the son of a rich iron merchant. At the time when the merchants of England were creating a new and higher kind of princes, on his father's side he came from an old Welsh family, and on his mother's side from the Heywoods and Sir Thomas More's family. Both families were Catholic, and in his early life persecution was brought near. For his brother died in prison for harboring a prescribed list, and his own education could not be continued in Oxford and Cambridge because of his religion. Such an experience generally sets a man's religious standards of life, but presently done as he studied law at Lincoln's Inn was investigating the philosophic grounds of all faith. Gradually he left the church in which he was born, renounced all domination and called himself simply Christian. Meanwhile, for Cadiz in 1596 and for the Azores in 1597 and on sea and in Kent found time to write poetry. Two of his best poems, The Storm and The Calm, belong to this period. Next, he traveled in Europe for 3 years but occupied himself with study and poetry. Returning home, he became secretary to Lord Egerton, fell in love with our daughter's young niece anymore and married her, for which cause Dunn was cast into prison. Strangely enough, his poetical work at this time is not a song of youthful romance but the progress of the soul. A study of transmigration, years of wandering and poverty followed, until Sir George Moore forgave the young lovers and made an allowance to his daughter. Instead of enjoying his new comforts, Dunn grew more ascetic and intellectual in his taste. England and of receiving a comfortable living by his pseudo martyr, he attracted the favor of James I, who persuaded him to be ordained, but yet left him without any place or employment. When his wife died, her allowances and Dunn was left with 7 children in extreme poverty. Then he became a preacher, rose rapidly by sheer intellectual force and genius, and in 4 years was the greatest of English preachers and Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There he carried some to heaven in holy lectures and led others to amend their lives. And as he leaned over the pulpit with intense earnestness, like by Jack Walton to an angel leaning from a cloud. Here is variety enough to epitomize his age and yet in all his time. Stronger than any impression of outward real or good is the sense of mystery that surrounds Gun. In all his work one finds a mystery, a hiding of some deep thing which the world would gladly know and share, and which is suggested in his haunting little poem, The Undertaking. I have done one braver thing than all the worthies did, and yet a braver hence the spring, which is to keep that high. Donne's poetry. Donne's poetry is so uneven, at times so startling and fantastic, that few critics would care to recommend it to others. Only a few will read his works, and they must be led to their own browsing to find what pleases them like deer fish in the midst of plenty, take a bite here and there and wander on, tasting 20 varieties of food in an hour's feeding. One who reads much will probably be well done the lack of any consistent style or literary standard. For instance, Chaucer and Milton are as different as two poets could well be, yet the work of each is marked by a distinct and consistent style, and it is the style as much as the matter which makes the tale of the Paradise Lost a work for all time. Then, through style and all literary standards to the winds. And precisely for this reason, he is forgotten, though his great intellect and his genius had marked him as one of those who should do things worthy to be remembered, while the tendency of literature is to exalt style at the expense of thought. The world has many men and women who exalt feeling and thought above expression, and to these Donne is good reading. Browning is of the same school and compels attention, while Donne played havoc with Elizabethan style. He nevertheless influenced our literature in the way of boldness and originality, and the present tendency is to give him a larger place, nearer to the few great poets than he has occupied since Ben Jonson declared that he was the first poet of the world in something but likely to perish or not being understood. For too much of his poetry we must apply it once direct verses on another's stupidity. Infinite work which doth so far extend that none can study it to any end. George Herbert, born in 1593 and died in 1633, O day most calm, most bright, sang George Herbert, and we may safely take that single line as expressive of the whole spirit of his writings. Professor Palmer, whose scholarly edition of this poet's works is a model for critics and editors, calls Hubbard the first in English poetry who spoke face to face with God. That may be few, but it is interesting to note that not a poet of the first half of the 17th century, not even the Gayest of the Cavaliers, but has written some noble verse of prayer or aspiration which expresses the underlying Puritan spirit of his age. Hubbard is the greatest, the most consistent of them all. In all the others, the Puritan struggles against the Cavalier, or the Cavalier breaks loose from the restraining Puritan. But in Hubbard, the struggle is past and peace has come, that his life was not all calm, that the Briton in him had struggled desperately before it subdued the pride and idleness of the Cavalier, is evident to one who reads between his lines. I struck the board and cried, no more I'll abroad. What shall I ever sigh and pine? My line and life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind. There speaks a cavalier of the university and the court, and as one reads to the end of the little poem, which he calls by the suggestive name of the caller, he may know that he is reading condensed biography. Those who seek for faults, for strained imagery and fantastic verse forms in Herbert's poetry, will find them in abundance, but it will better repay the reader to look for the deep thought and find feeling that are hidden in these wonderful religious lyrics. Even in those that appear most artificial, the fact that Herbert's reputation was greater at times than Milton's, and that his poems, when published after his death, had a large sale and influence, shows certainly that he appealed to the men of his age, and his poems will probably be read and appreciated if only by the few, just so long as men are strong enough to understand the Puritan's spiritual convictions. Life of George Herbert. Herbert's life is so quiet and uneventful that to relate a few biographical facts can be of little advantage. Only as one reads the whole story by Isaac Walton can he share the gentle spirit of Herbert's poetry. He was born at Montgomery Castle, Wales, 1593, of a noble Welsh family. His university course was brilliant, and after graduation, he waited long years in the vain hope of preferment at court. All his life he had to battle against disease, and this is undoubtedly the cause of the long delay before each new step in his course. Not till he was 37 was he ordained and raised over the little church of Bemerton. How he lived here among plain people in this happy corner of the Lord's field, hoping all things and blessing all people, asking his own way, to Sion and showing others the way, should be read in Walton. It is a brief life, less than 3 years of work before being cut off by consumption, but remarkable for the single great purpose and the glorious spiritual strength that shine through physical weakness. Just before his death, he gave some manuscripts to a friend, and his message is worthy of John Bunyan. Deliver this little book to my dear brother Farah and tell him he shall find in it a picture of the many spiritual conflicts that have passed betwixt God and my soul before I could subject mine to the will of Jesus, my Master, in whose service I have now found perfect freedom. Desire him to read it, and then, if he can think it may turn to the advantage of any defective poor soul, let it be made public. If not, let him burn it, for I and it are less than the least of God's mercy. Herbert's poem. Herbert's chief work, The Temple, consists of over 150 short poems suggested by the church. Her holidays and ceremonials and the experiences of the Christian life. The first poem, The Church Porch, is the longest and though polished with a care that foreshadows the classic school, the least poetical. It is a wonderful collection of condensed sermons, wise precepts, and moral lessons suggesting Chaucer's good counsel. Pope's essay on men and Polynesia's advice to Lartes in Hamlet, only it is more packed with thought than any of the. Of truth speaking, he says, dare to be true, nothing can be the lie. A fault which needs it must draws to thereby. And of calmness in argument, calmness is great advantage, he that lets another chef may wow him at his fire. Among the remaining poems of the temple, one of the most suggestive is the pilgrimage. Here in six short stanzas, every line close packed with thought, we have the whole of Bunyan Pilgrim's Progress. The poem was written probably before Bunyan was born, but remembering the wide influence of Herbert's poetry, it is an interesting question whether Bunyan received the idea of his immortal work from this pilgrimage. Probably the best known of all his poems is the one called The Plea, which generally appears, however, under the name Rest or the Gifts of God. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches which dispersed lie contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creation, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So born should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with refining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Among the poems which may be read as curiosities of verification and which arouse the wrath of the critics against the whole metaphysical school are those like East Wings and the Altar, which suggest in the printed form of the poem the thing of which the poet sings. More ingenious is the poem in which rhyme is made by cutting off the first letter of a preceding word, as in the five stanzas of Paradise. I bless thee, Lord, because I grow among thy trees which in a grove. To thee both fruit and order owe, and more ingenious still are our conceits like the poem Heaven.
स्वागत है आपका के जॉय की दुनिया में The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
More ingenious is the poem in which rhyme is made by cutting off the first letter of a preceding word, as in the five stanzas of Paradise. I bless thee, Lord, because I grow among thy trees which in a row. To thee both fruit and order grow, and more ingenious still are odd conceits like the poem Heaven, in which echo, by repeating the last syllable of each line, gives an answer to the poet's questions. The cavalier poets in the literature of any age, there are generally found two distinct tendencies. The first expresses the dominant spirit of the times, the second a secret or an open rebellion. So in this age, side by side with the serious and rational Puritan, lives the gallant and trivial cavalier. The Puritan finds expression in the best poetry of the period, from Donne to Milton and in the prose of Baxter and Bunyan. The cavalier in a small group of poets, Herrick Lovelace, Suckling and Carew, who write songs generally in light vein, gay, trivial, often licentious, but who cannot altogether escape the tremendous seriousness of Puritanism. Thomas Carew, 1598, Thomas Carew, born in 1598 and died in 1639. Carew may be called the inventor of Cavalier love poetry, and to him, more than to any other, is due the peculiar combination of the sensual and the religious which mark the most of the minor poets of the 17th century. His poetry is the Spenserian pastoral stipend, striped of its refinement of feeling and made direct, coarse, vigorous. His poems, published in 1640, are generally, like his life, trivial or sensual, but here and there is found one, like the following, which indicates that with the metaphysical and cavalier poets, a new and stimulating force had entered English literature. Ask me no more where Joe bestows when June is past the fading rose, for in your beauty's orient deep, these flowers as in their causes sleep. Ask me no more where those stars lie that downwards fall in dead of night, for in your eyes they sit and their peaks become as in their sphere. Ask me no more if east or west the phoenix builds her spicy nest, for unto you at last she flies, and in your fragrant bosom dies. Robert Herrick, who born in 1591 and died in 1674. Herrick is the new cavalier gay. Devil may care indisposition by some freak of fate, a clergyman of Dean Prior in South Devon, a county made famous by him and Blackmore. Here in a country parish, he lived discontentedly, longing for the joys of London and the mermaid taverns. His bachelor establishment, consisting of an old housekeeper, a cat, a dog, a goose, a tame lamb, one hen, for which he thanked God in poetry because she laid an egg every day, and a pet pig that drank beer with Harry out of a tankard. With admirable good nature, Herrick made the best of these uncongenial surroundings. He watched with sympathy the country life about him and caught its spirit in many lyrics, a few of which, like Corina's maying, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, and to daffodils are among the best known in our language. His poems covered a wide range, from trivial love songs, pagan in spirit, to hymns of deep religious feeling. Only the best of his poems should be read, and these are remarkable for their exquisite sentiment and their graceful, melodious expression. The rest, since they reflect something of the coarseness of his audience, may be passed over in silence. Late in life, Herrick published his own book, Has Paradise and Noble Numbers 1648. The later half contained his religious poems, and one has only to read there the remarkable litany to see how the religious terror that finds expression in Bunyan's grace abounding could master even the most careless of cavalier singers. Suckling and Lovelace, Sir John Suckling, born in 1609 and died in 1642, was one of the most brilliant wits of the court of Charles I, who wrote poetry as he exercised a horse or fought a duel, because it was considered a gentleman accomplishment in those days. His poems struck from his wide life like sparks from his rapier, are utterly trivial, and even in his best known ballad upon a wedding, rarely rise above mere doggerel. It is only the romance of his life, his rich, brilliant, careless youth, and his poverty and suicide in Paris, whither he fled because of his devotion to the Stuarts, that keeps his name alive in our literature. In his life and poetry, Sir Richard Lovelace, who born in 1618 and died in 1658, offers a remarkable parallel to Suckling, and the two are often classed together as perfect representatives of the followers of King Charles. Lovelace Lucasta, a volume of love lyrics, is generally on a higher plane than Suckling's work, and a few of the poems like to Lucasta and to Althea from the prison deserve the secure place they have won. In the later occur of the oft-quoted lines, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bar the cage. Minds innocent and quite take that for an hermitage. If I have freedom in my love and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty. John Milton, who born in 1608 and died in 1674. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart, thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea. pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free. So didst thou travel on life's common way, in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the loveliest beauties on herself did lay. From Wordsworth's sonnet on Milton. Shakespeare and Milton are the two figures that tower conspicuously above the goodly fellowship of men, who have made our literature famous. Each is representative of the age that produced him, and together they form a suggestive commentary upon the two forces that rule our humanity, the force of impulse and the force of a fixed purpose. Shakespeare is the poet of impulse, of the loves, hates, fear, jealousies, and ambitions that swayed the men of his age. Milton is the poet of steadfast will and purpose, who moves like a god amid the fear and hopes and changing impulses of the world, regarding them as trivial and momentary things that can never sphere a great soul from its course. It is well to have some such comparison in mind while studying the literature of the Elizabethan and the Puritan age, while Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and their unequalled company of wits make merry at the Mermaid taverns, there is already growing up on the same London street a poet who shall bring a new force into literature, who shall add to the Renaissance culture and love of beauty the tremendous moral earnestness of the Puritan. Such a poet must begin, as the Puritan always began, with his own soul to discipline and enlighten it before expressing its beauty in literature. He that would hope to write well hereafter in laudable things, says Milton, ought himself to be a true poet, that is, a composition and patron of the best and most honorable things. Here is a new proposition in art which suggests the lofty ideal of Fra Angelico, that before one can write literature, which is the expression of the ideal, he must first develop in himself the ideal man. Because Milton is human, he must know the best in humanity. Therefore, he studies, giving his days to music, art, and literature, his nights to profound research and meditation. But because he knows that man is more than mortal, he also prays, depending as he tells us one devout prayer to that eternal spirit who can enrich with all utterance and knowledge. Such a poet is already in spirit far beyond the Renaissance, though he lives in the autumn of its glory and associates with its literary masters. There is a spirit in man, says the old Hebrew poet, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth him understanding. Here, in a word, is the secret of Milton's life and writing. Hence his long silences, years passing without a word, and when he speaks, it is like the voice of a prophet who begins with the sublime announcement. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Hence his style producing an impression of sublimity, which has been marked for wonder by every historian of our literature. His style was unconsciously sublime because he lived and thought consciously in a sublime atmosphere. Life of Milton. Milton is like an ideal in the soul, like a lofty mountain on the horizon, We never attain the ideal, we never climb the mountain, but life would be inexpressibly poorer were either to be taken away. From childhood, Milton's parents set him apart for the attainment of noble end, and so left nothing to chance in the matter of training. His father, John Milton, is said to have turned Puritan while a student at Oxford and to have been disinherited by his family. Thereupon he settled in London and prospered greatly as a scrivener, that is, a kind of notary. In charter, the elder Milton was a rare combination of scholar and businessman, a radical Puritan in politics and religion, yet a musician whose hymns tunes are still sung, and a lover of art and literature. The poet's mother was a woman of refinement and social grace, with a deep interest in religion and in local charity. So the boy grew up in a home which combined the culture of the Renaissance with the piety and moral strength of early Puritanism. He begins, therefore, as the heir of one great age and the prophet of another. Apparently, the elder Milton shared Bacon's dislike for the educational methods of the time and so took charge of his son's training, encouraging his natural taste, teaching him music, and seeking out a tutor who helped the boy to what he sought most eagerly. Not the grammar and mechanism of Greek and Latin, but rather the stories, the ideals, the poetry that hide in their incomparable literature. At 12 years, we find the boy already a scholar in spirit, unable to rest till after midnight because of the joy with which his study was rewarded. From boyhood to great principles seemed to guide Milton's career. One, the love of beauty, of music, art, literature, and indeed of every form of human culture. The other, a steadfast devotion to study as the highest object in human life. A brief course at the famous St. Paul's School in London was the prelude to Milton's entrance to Christ College, Cambridge. Here again he followed his natural bent and, like Bacon, found himself often in opposition to the authorities. Aside from some Latin poems, the most noteworthy song of this period of Milton's life is his splendid ode on the morning of Christ's Nativity, which was begun on Christmas Day 1629. Milton, while deep in the classics, had yet a great love for his native literature. Spenser was 4 years his master. In his verse we find every evidence of his loving study of Shakespeare, and his last great poems show clearly how he had been influenced by Fletcher, Christ's victory and triumph. But it is significant that this first ode rises higher than anything of the kind produced in the famous age of Elizabeth. While at Cambridge, it was the desire of his parents that Milton should take orders in the Church of England. But the intense love of mental liberty which stampeded the Puritan was too strong within him, and he refused to consider the oath of servitude, as he called it, which would mark his ordinance throughout his life. Milton, though profoundly religious, held aloof from the strife of sex. In belief, he belonged to the extreme Puritans called separatists, independents, congregationists, of which our pilgrim fathers are the great example, but he refused to be bound by any creed or church discipline. As ever in my great taskmaster's eye, in this last line of one of his sonnets is found Milton's rejection of every form of outward religious authority in face of the supreme Puritan principle, the liberty of the individual soul before God. A long period of retirement followed Milton's withdrawal from the university in 1632. At his father's country home in Horton, he gave himself up for 6 years to solitary reading and study, roaming over the wide fields of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Spanish, French, Italian, and English literature, and studying hard at mathematics, science, theology, and music. A curious combination. To his love of music, we owe the melody of all his poetry, and we note it in the rhythm and balance, which make even his mighty prose arguments harmonious. In Lycidas Allegro, Allegro, second Tennesseroso, Arcades, Comus, and a few sonnets, we have the poetic results of this retirement at Horton, few indeed, but the most perfect of their kind that our literature has recorded. Out of solitude, where his talent was perfected, Milton entered the busy world, where his character was to be proved to the utmost. From Horton he travelled abroad, through France, Switzerland, and Italy, everywhere received with admiration for his learning and courtesy, winning the friendship of the exiled Dutch scholar Grotius in Paris and of Galileo in his sad imprisonment in Florence. He was on his way to Greece when news reached him of the break between king and parliament. With a practical insight which never deserted him, Milton saw clearly the meaning of the news. His cordial reception in Italy, so chary of praise to anything not Italian, had reawakened in Milton the old desire to write an epic which England would not willingly let die. But at thought of the conflict for human freedom, all his dreams were flung to the winds. He gave up his travels and literary ambitions and hurried to England. For I thought it base, he says, to be travelling at my age, to be travelling at my ease for intellectual culture, while my fellow countrymen at home were fighting for liberty. Then for nearly 20 years, the poet of great achievement and still greater promise disappears. We hear no more songs, but only the prose, denunciations, and arguments which are as remarkable as his poetry. In all our literature, there is nothing more worthy of the Puritan spirit than this laying aside of personal ambition in order to join in the struggle for human liberty. In his best known sonnet on his blindness, which reflects his grief not at darkness but at this abandoned dreams, we catch the sublime spirit of this renunciation. Milton's opportunity to sow came in the crisis of 1649. The king had been sent to the scaffold, paying the penalty of his own treachery, and England sat shivering at its own deed. like a child or a Russian peasant who in sudden passion resists unbearable brutality and then is afraid of the consequences. 2 weeks of anxiety, of terror and silence followed. Then appeared Milton's tenor of kings and magistrates. To England, it was like the coming of a strong man, not only to protect the child but to justify his love for liberty. Kings, no less than people, are subject to the eternal principle of law, the divine right of people to defend and protect themselves. That was the mighty argument which calmed the people's dread and proclaimed that a new man and a new principle had arisen in England. Milton was called to be secretary for foreign terms in the new government, and for the next few years, until the end of the Commonwealth, there were two leaders in England: Cromwell, the man of action; Milton, the man of thought. It is doubtful to which of the two humanity was most for its emancipation from the tyranny of kings and prelates. Two things of personal interest deserve mention in this period of Milton's life: his marriage and his blindness. In 1643, he married Mary Powell, a shallow, pleasure-loving girl, the daughter of a royalist, and that was the beginning of sorrows. After a month tiring of the austere life of a Puritan household, she abandoned her husband, who, with the same radical reasoning with which he dealt with affairs of state, promptly repudiated the marriage. His doctrine and discipline of divorce and his tetrachordon are the arguments to justify his position, but they aroused a storm of protest in England, and they suggest to a modern reader that Milton was perhaps as much to blame as his wife, and that he had scant understanding of a woman's nature when his wife, peering for a position, appeared before him in tears. All his ponderous arguments were swept aside by a generous impulse, and though the marriage was never a happy one, Milton never again mentioned his wife's desertion. The scene in Paradise Lost where Eve comes weeping to Adam, seeking peace and pardon, is probably a reflection of a scene in Milton's own household. His wife died in 1653, and a few years later he married another, whom we remember for the sonnet, Mad Thought. I saw my late espoused saint, in which she celebrated. She died after 15 months, and in 1663 he married a third wife who helped the blind old man to manage his poor household. From boyhood, the strain on the poet's eyes had grown more and more severe, but even when his sight was threatened, he held steadily his purpose of using his pen in the service of his country. During the king's imprisonment, a book appeared called Icon Vasili Royal Image, giving every picture of the king's piety and condemning the Puritans. The book speedily became famous and was the source of all royalist arguments against the Commonwealth. In 1649 appeared Milton's Iconoclast Image Breaker, which demolished the flimsy arguments of the Icon Vasili as a charge of Cromwell's Ironsides had overwhelmed the king's followers. After the execution of the king appeared another famous attack upon the Puritans. Defensio Reggio Pro Carlo I, instigates by Charles II, who was then living in exile. It was written in Latin by Salmasius, a Dutch professor at Leiden, and was hailed by the royalists as an invincible argument. By order of the Council of State, Milton prepared a reply. His eyesight had sadly failed, and he was warned that any further strain would be disastrous. His reply was characteristic of the man and the Puritan, as he had once sacrificed his poetry. last, the last part of Milton's life is a picture of solidarity grandeur, solitary grandeur, unequaled in literature, unequaled in literary history. Milton's answer is worthy of his own great life, without envy or bitterness. He goes back to the early dream of an immortal poem and begins with superb consciousness of power to dictate. His great epic, Paradise Lost, was finished in 1665. After 7 years' labor in darkness, with great difficulty, he found a publisher, and for the great work, now the most honored poem is in our literature, he received less than certain verse makers of our day receive for a little song in one of our popular magazines. Its success was immediate, though, like all his work, it met with venomous criticism. Dryden summed up the impression made on thoughtful minds of his time when he said, "This man cuts us all out, and the ancient too." There, after a bit of sunshine came into his darkened home, for the work stamped him as one of the great world's great writer, and from England the continent pilgrims came in increasing numbers to speak their gratitude. The next year, Milton began his Paradise again. In 1671 appeared his last important work, Samson Agonistes, the most powerful dramatic poem on the Greek model, which our language possesses the picture of Israel's mighty champion, blind, alone, afflicted by thoughtless enemies, but preserving a noble ideal to the end, is a fitting close to the life work of the poet himself. For years he was silent, dreaming, who shall say that dreams in his darkness and saying cheerfully to his friends, still guides the heavenly vision. He died peacefully in 1674, the most sublime and the most lonely figure in our literature. Milton, early poetry. In his early work, Milton appears as the inheritor of all that was best known in Elizabethan literature. And his first work, the Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, approaches the high watermark of lyric poetry in England. In the next years, the next 6 years, from 1631 to 1637, he wrote but little, scarcely more than 2,000 lines. But these are among the most exquisite and the most perfectly finished in our language. El Allegro and Second Penseroso are twin poems containing many lines and short descriptive passages which linger in the mind like strains of music and which are known and loved wherever England is spoken. El Allegro, the joyous or happy man, is like an excursion into the English fields at sunrise. The air is sweet, birds are singing, a multitude of sights, sounds, fragrances fill all the senses, and to this appeal of nature, the soul of responds by being happy, seeing in every flower and hearing in every harmony some exquisite symbol of human life. Second, Penseroso takes us over the same ground at twilight and at moonrise. The air is still fresh and fragrant. The symbolism is, if possible, more tenderly beautiful than before, but the gay mood is gone, though its memory lingers in the afterglow of the sunset. A quiet thoughtfulness takes the place of the pure joyous sensuousness of the morning, a thoughtfulness which is not sad, though like all quiet moods it is akin to sadness and which sounds the deeps of human emotion in the presence of nature. To cut the scattered lines of either poem is to do injustice to both. They should be read in their entirety the same day, one at morning, the other at magnitude, eventitude. Eventide if one is to appreciate their beauty and suggestiveness. The mask of Comus is in the mask of Comus is in many respects the most perfect of Milton's poems. It was written in 1634 to be performed at Ludlow Castle before the Earl of Bridgewater and his friends. There is a tradition that the Earl's three children had been lost in the woods, and whether true or not, Milton takes the simple theme of a person lost, calls in an attendant spirit to protect the wanderer, and out of this, with its natural action and melodious songs, makes the most exquisite pastoral drama that we possess. In form, it is a mask like those gorgeous products of the Elizabethan age, of which Ben Jonson was the master. England had bought the idea of the mask from Italy and had used it as the chief entertainment at all festivals until it had become to the nobles of England what the miracle play had been to the common people of a previous generation. Milton, with its strong Puritan spirit, could not be content with the mere entertainment of an idle art. Hummus has the gorgeous scenic effects, the music and dancing of other masquers. But its moral purpose and its ideal teachings are unmistakable. The triumph of virtue would be a better name for this perfect little masque, for its theme is that virtue and innocence can walk through any peril of this world without permanent harm. This eternal triumph of good over evil is proclaimed by the attendant spirit who has protected the innocent in this life and who now disappears from mortal sight to resume its life of joy. Mortals that would follow me, love virtue, she alone is free. She can teach ye how to climb higher than the spheric child, or if virtue feeble world, heaven itself would stoop to her. While there are undoubted traces of Johnson and Johnson in Milton's Thomas, the poem for surpasses its predecessors in the airy beauty and melody of its verses. In the next poem, Lycidas, a pastoral elegy written in 1637, and the last of his Horton poems, Milton is no longer the inheritor of the old age, but the prophet of a new. A college friend, Edward King, had been drowned in the Irish Sea, and Milton follows the poetic custom of his age by representing both his friend and himself in the guise of shepherd, leading the pastoral life. Milton also uses all the symbols of his predecessor, introducing fawns, satyrs, and sea nymphs. But again, the Puritan is not content with heathen symbolism and so introduces a new symbol of the Christian shepherd responsible for the souls of men, whom he likens to hungry sheep that look up and are not fed. The Puritans and Royalists at this time were drifting rapidly apart, and Milton uses his new symbolism to denounce the abuses that had crept into the church. In any other point, this moral teaching would hinder the free use of the imagination. But Milton seems equal to the task of combining high moral purpose with the noblest poetry in its exquisite finish and exhaustless imagery. Lycidas surpasses most of the poetry of what is often called the pagan Renaissance. Besides these well-known poems, Milton wrote in this early period a fragmentary mass called Arcades. Arcades, several Latin poems like his English are exquisitely finished, and his famous sonnets, which brought this Italian form of verse nearly to the point of perfection. In them, he seldom wrote of love, the usual subject with his predecessors, but of patriotism, beauty, music, and subjects of political interest suggested by the struggle into which England was drifting. Among these sonnets, each reader must find his own favorites, those best known and most frequently quoted are on his deceased wife, the Nightingale, on reaching the age of 23, the massacre in Piedmont, and the two on his blindness. Milton Prose. Of Milton Prose works, there are many divergent opinions, ranging from Macaulay's unbounded praise to the condemnation of some of our modern critics. From a literary point of view, Milton prose would be stronger if less violent, and a modern writer would hardly be excused for using his language or his methods. But we must remember the times and the methods of his opponents. In his Fiery zeal against injustice, the poet is suddenly dominated by the soldier spirit. He first musters his facts in battalions and charges upon the enemy to crush and overpower without mercy. For Milton, hates injustice, and because it is an enemy of his people, he cannot and will not spare it. When the victory is won, the exults in a paean of victory, and soul stirring as the song of Deborah. He is the poet again, in spite of himself, and his mind filled with magnificent imagery. Even with a subject so dull, so barren of the bare possibilities of poetry, as his animate versions upon the remonstrants defense, he breaks out into an invocation. Who, though that sittest in light and glory, unapproachable, parent of angels and men, which is like a chapter from the Apocalypse. In such passages, Milton's prose is as Tenney suggests an outpouring of splendor, which suggests the noblest poetry. An account of their controversial character, these prose works are seldom read, and it is probable that Milton never thought of them as worthy of a place in literature. Of them all, Arupazatika has perhaps the most permanent interest and is best worth reading on Milton's time. There was there were endorsed by the official censor. Needless to say, the censor holding his office and salary by fear was naturally more concerned with the divine right of kings and bishops than with the delights of literature, and many books were suppressed for no better reason than that they were displeasing to the authorities. Milton protested against this, as against every other form of tyranny, and his Areopagitica, so called from the Areopagus or form of Athens, the place of public appeal, and the marsh hill of St. Paul's address is the most famous plea in English for the freedom of the press. Milton later poetry, undoubtedly the noblest of Milton's works, written when he was blind and suffering, are Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. The first is the greatest. Indeed, indeed, the only generally acknowledged epic in our literature since Beowulf. The last is the most perfect specimen of a drama after the Greek method in our language. Of the history of the great epic, we have some interesting glimpses. In Cambridge, there is preserved a notebook of Milton's containing a list of nearly 100 subjects for a Greek poem selected while he was a boy at the university. King Arthur attracted him at first, but his choice finally settled upon the fall of man, and we have four separate outlines showing Milton's proposed treatment of the subject. These outlines indicate that he contemplated a mighty drama or miracle play, but whether because of Newton's antipathy to plays and players or because of the dramatic treatment of religious subjects which Milton had witnessed in Italy, he abandoned the idea of a play and settled on the form of an epic poem. Most fortunately, it must be conceded, for Milton had not the knowledge of man necessary for a drama. As a study of character, Paradise Lost would be a grievous failure. Adam, the central character, is something of a prig, while Satan looms up a magnificent figure entirely different from the devil of the miracle plays and completely overshadowing the hero both in interest and in manliness. The other characters, the Almighty, the Son, Raphael, Michael, the angels, and fallen spirits are merely mouthpieces for Milton's declamation without any personal or human interest. Regarded as a drama, therefore Paradise Lost would never have been a success. But as poetry, with its sublime imagery, its harmonious verse, its titanic background of heaven, hell, and the illimitable void that lies between, it is unsurpassed in any literature. In 1658, Milton, in his darkness, sat down to dictate the work which he had planned 30 years before. In order to understand the mighty sweep of the poem, it is necessary to sum up the argument of the 12 books as follows. It will be seen that this is a colossal epic, not of a man or a hero, but of the whole race of men, and that Milton's characters are such as no human mind could adequately portray. But the scenes, the splendors of heaven, the horrors of hell, the serene beauty of paradise, the sun and planets suspended between celestial light and gross darkness are pictured with an imagination that is almost superhuman. The abiding interest of the poem is in these colossal pictures and in the lofty thought and the marvelous melody with which they are impressed on our minds. The poem is in blank verse and not until Milton used it did we learn the infinite variety and harmony of which it is capable. He played with it, changing its melody and movement on every page. As an organist, out of a single theme develops an unending variety of harmony. Lamartine has described Paradise Lost as the dream of a Puritan fallen asleep over his Bible, and this suggestive description did just to the curious fact that it is the dream, not the theology or the descriptions of the Bible scene that chiefly interests us. Thus, Milton describes the separation of earth and water, and there is little or nothing added to the simplicity and strength of Genesis, but the sunset which follows is Milton's own dream, and instantly we are transported to a land of beauty and poetry. Now came still evening on, and twilight grey had in her sober livery all things clad. Silence accompanied for beast and bird, they do their gracy couch. These to their nest were slung all but the wakeful nightingale. She all night long her amorous descent sung. Silence was pleased, now glowed the firemen with living sapphires. Hesperus that led the starry host brought brightest till the moon, rising in clouded majesty at length. Apparent queen unveiled her peerless light, and over the dark her silver mantle threw. So also Milton the Almighty, considered purely as a literary character, is unfortunately tinged with a narrow and literal theology of the time. He is a being enormously egotistic, the despot rather than the servant of the universe, seated upon a throne with a chorus of angels about him, eternally singing his praises and ministering to a kind of divine vanity. It is not necessary to search heaven for such a character. The type is too common upon earth, but in Saturn, Milton breaks away from crude medieval conception. He follows the dream again and gives us a lecture to admire and understand. Is this the reason, this the soil, the climb? Said then the lost archangel, this is the seed that we must change for heaven this mournful gloom, for that celestial light be it so, since he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right, farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equalled, for hath made supreme. Above his equals feel well, happy fields where joy forever dwell. Hail horrors, hail infernal word, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where if I be still the same, and what I should be all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not willed. Here for his and we will not drive us hand. Here we may reason secure, and in my choice, reason is worth ambition, though in hell, better to reason in hell than serve in heaven. In this magnificent heroism, Milton had unconsciously immortalized the Puritan spirit, the same unconquerable spirit that set men to writing poems and allegories when in prison for the faith, and that sent them over the stormy sea in a cork shell to found a free commonwealth in the wilds of America. For a modern reader, the understanding of Paradise Lost presupposes two things: a knowledge of the first chapters of the scripture and of the general principles of Calvinistic theology. But it is a pity to use the poem, as has so often been done, to teach a literal acceptance of one or more or the other of the theology of Paradise Lost. The least said, the better. But to the splendor of the Puritan dream and the glorious melody of its expression, no words can do justice. Even a slight acquaintance will make the reader understand why it ranks with the Divina Commedia of Dante, and why it is generally accepted by critics as the greatest single poem in our literature. Soon after the completion of Paradise Lost, Thomas Elwood, a friend of Milton, asked one day after reading the manuscript, but what hast thou to say of Paradise Found? It was in response to this suggestion that Milton wrote the second part of the great epic known to us as Paradise Regained. The first tells how mankind, in the person of Adam, fell at the first temptation by Satan and became an outcast from paradise and from divine grace. The second shows how mankind, in the person of Christ, withstands the tempter and is established once more in the divine favor. Christ's temptation in the wilderness is the theme, and Milton follows the account in the fourth chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Though Paradise Regained was Milton's favorite, and though it has many passages of noble thought and and splendid imagery equal to the best of Paradise Lost. The poem as a whole falls below the level of the first and is less interesting to read. In Samson Agonistes, Milton turns to a more vital and personal theme, and his genius transfigures the story of Samson, the mighty champion of Israel, now blind and scorned, working as a slave among the Philistines. The poet's aim was to present in English a pure tragedy, with all the passion and restraint which mark the old Greek dramas. That he succeeded where others failed is due to two causes. First, Milton himself suggests the hero of one of the Greek tragedies. His sorrow and affliction give to his noble nature that touch of melancholy and calm dignity which is in perfect keeping with his subject. Second, Milton is telling his own story. Like Samson, he had struggled mightily against the enemies of his race. He had taken a wife from the Philistines and had paid the penalty. He was blind, alone, scorned by his vain and thoughtless master. To the essential action of the tragedy, Milton would add, therefore, that touch of intense yet restrained personal feeling which carries more conviction than any argument. Samson is in many respects the most convincing of his works, entirely apart from the interest of its subject and treatment. One may obtain from it a better idea of what Greek tragedy was among the Greeks than from any other work in our language. Nothing is here for tears, nothing to wail or knock the breast, no weakness, no contempt, disparage or blame, nothing but well and fair, and what may quiet as in death so noble, prose writers of the Puritan period. John Bunyan, who born in 1628 and died in 1688, as there is but one poet great enough to express the Puritan spirit, so there is but one commanding prose writer, John Bunyan. Milton was the child of the Renaissance, inheritor of all its culture, and the most profoundly educated man of his age. Bunyan was a poor, uneducated thinker. From the Renaissance, he inherited nothing. But from the Reformation, he received an excess of that spiritual independence which had caused the Puritan struggle for liberty. These two men, representing the extremes of English life in the 17th century, wrote the two works that stand today for the mighty Puritan spirit. One gave us the only epics in Beowulf. The other gave us our only great allegory, which has been read more than any other book in our language save the Bible. Life of Bunyan. Bunyan is an extraordinary figure. We must study him as well as his books. Fortunately, we have his life story in his own words, written with the same lovable modesty and sincerity that mark all his work. Reading that story now in Grace Abounding, we see two great influences at work in his life. One from within was his own vivid imagination, which saw visions, allegories, parables, revelation in every common event. The other from without was the spiritual ferment of the age, the multiplication of strange sects, Quakers, free willers, renters, Anabaptists, millionaires, and the unhampered zeal of all classes, like an engine without a balance wheel, when men were breaking away from authority and setting up their own religious standards. Bunyan's life is an epitome of that astonishing religious individualism which marked the close of the English Reformation. He was born in the little village of Elstow, Near Bedford in 1628, the son of a poor tinker, for a little while the boy was sent to school where he learned to read and write a profession. But he was soon busy in his father's shop where a profession, but he was soon busy in his father's shop where amid the glowing pots and the fire and smoke of his little forge, he saw vivid pictures of hell and the devils which haunted him all his life. When he was 16 years old, his father married the second time, whereupon Banyan ran away and became a soldier in the parliamentary army. The religious ferment of the age made a tremendous impression on Banyan's sensitive imagination. He went to church occasionally only to find himself wrapped in terrors and torments by some fiery literate preacher. And he would rush violently away from church to forget his fear by joining in Sunday sports on the village green. I thank all my brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, students, scholars, teacher, trainer, professor, professional, officer, official, listener, learners. I thank all respected doctors and directors. I thank all honorable ministers, managers. I thank all honorable advocates, advertisers, district supervisors. Nice to see all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.